So in the aftermath of the recent Buffalo shooting, I saw this tweet that inspired this video, and basically by the Eric Lewis. I think it's really interesting that the Buffalo shooter mentioned his affinity for East Asians, specifically in his manifesto. Given the context of how old he is and how active he was online, it makes me wonder how much anime subcultures played a role in his ideology. At the intersection of anime and manga, gaming, cosplay exists a violent anti-blackness, and there's no denying that these spaces cater heavily to white consumers. I think it's important to recognise how these subcultures are complicit in the violence against black bodies. For a lot of white consumers, anime affords them the delusion of escaping to a world where their problems don't exist, oftentimes the problem being black folk. Whether intentional or not, you'll have to acknowledge the role it plays. So if you have subscribed to my channel for the last year or so, you will know I've actually covered a lot of these like anime subcultures and how there are anime about like Veraboo stuff with the aesthetics of the German military in World War II, and how like 4chan, 2chan, these hotbeds of white supremacist radicalization, how anime often ties into that stuff. But I don't want to specifically talk about anime, although we will talk about it a bit in terms of the sexualization and fetishization of Japanese and East Asian women. But today what I wanted to talk about was why so many white supremacists either give a pass to East Asians or actually accept East Asians as part of their vision for this racist future. And this is nothing new. I actually did go through the Buffalo shooters manifesto to specifically read the part about East Asians. Of course, Dylann Roof also gave a pass to East Asians, and he was a big simp for Japanese media. And this goes all the way back to Hitler, who before World War II, Nazi Germany actually had pretty strong ties with Chiang Kaishek. The Wehrmacht even trained some of the Chinese military, and they provided them with things like weapons. And of course, Germany was actually allied with fascist Japan during the Second World War, so there is a lot of precedent for that, and Hitler's own comments about respecting their history and culture is stuff that is a through line from him to modern day white supremacists. So in today's video, we're going to start by looking at the recent shooting, then we're going to talk about, you know, why mass shooters in America who are white supremacists do like East Asians, or at least give them a pass, tie it back to historical context, and then talk about how things like anime play a role. All of that coming up for you today, but before we get any further, if you want to support this video, please like the video, and in the comments, leave a comment on your thoughts on this stuff. Also, for every 5k, we get a new chocolate orange. The 75k orange is finally in sight, so please help me get over the finish line. Hopefully we get it by the end of the month, but who knows if that will happen. Also subscribe to my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra, where I archive my live streams, which I usually do 2 times a week. Also, if you want to support my work, because videos like this are obviously demonetized, please consider becoming a patron. I want to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and the benefits of that are getting access to my Nintendo Switch friend code and access to the private patrons Discord server, and also join my subreddit. The link is in the description. So to start the video, I do want to read you some of the Buffalo shooters manifesto. Like, this isn't going to be a video of me quoting it a lot, and I will actually say, for people who are trying to seek this out, if you are familiar with like 4chan, incel type neo-Nazi stuff, it really is not anything special. Skimming through this, I didn't see anything that particularly stood out to me as like, wow, this is unique. The only thing that seems a bit different is this guy said he would tolerate like LGB groups, but not transgender people. Who does that remind you of lately in the UK? Some very, very rich author. But he also references like 4chan, and of course 4chan, 2chan, these things were started to talk about anime. And then I just want to get onto the East Asian part before we start linking it to just general neo-Nazi ideology. So in his manifesto, he says, was there a particular event or reason you decided to commit this violent act? Before I begin, I would say I was not born racist nor grew up racist. I simply became racist after I learned the truth. I started browsing 4chan in May 2020 after extreme boredom. Remember, this was during the outbreak of COVID. I would normally browse K because I'm a gun nut, and Out because I love the outdoors, and eventually wound up on Pol. There I learned about infographics, shitposts, and memes that the white race is dying out, that blacks are disproportionately killing whites, that the average black takes $700,000 from taxpayers in their lifetime, and that the Jews and the elite were behind this. From there, I also found other sites like World Trade Video dailyarchives.org, and Daily Stormer. Moving on to the East Asian part, his is a bit different from some of the others, but when I refer to East Asians, I refer to those of Japanese, Korean, and Eastern Chinese descent. I think that East Asians are quite admirable. The average East Asian tends to perform better in academics than the average white, which of course leads to more skilled and higher paying jobs. This is all due to superior traditional values in genetics. However, they do not belong in white civilization. To preserve our cultures and people, we must be physically separated. Whites and East Asians will lead the way in technological advancement. We shall be close friends, but never lovers. I worry about problems they are having, such as depopulating society, rising cases of mental illnesses, and virtual relationships that seek to replace real relationships. I hope that they solve these problems before their society crumbles and is replaced by other races. So this type of thinking is, like I said, nothing new to white supremacists, and although the shooter says here he wants them to be separate, he does respect them. And although he doesn't want them part of his white ethnostate, and they would be part of the problem of white genocide, he does think they are better than whites in some regards and are natural allies to racist white people. And again, for someone who said they frequented 4chan and the Daily Stormer, this is nothing new, especially for someone who believes in the white genocide conspiracy theory. Now, of course, most famous fascist of all time, Hitler, also believed similar things about Japanese and Chinese people. So Hitler's attitude on different races on Medium by Alexander Young. Hitler saw both the Chinese and Japanese as honorary Aryans. He wrote, "Pride in one's race, and that does not imply contempt for other races, is also a normal and healthy sentiment. I have never regarded the Chinese or Japanese as being inferior to ourselves. They belong to ancient civilizations, and I admit freely that their history is superior to our own. They have the right to be proud of their past, just as we have the right to be proud of the civilization to which we belong. Indeed, I believe that the more steadfast the Chinese and Japanese remain in their pride of race, the easier I shall find it to get on with them." And just another article by Gerhard Krebs, Racism Under Negotiation, the Japanese Race in the Nazi German Perspective. As a blatant racist, Hitler disliked all non-European peoples. However, he made a slight exception insofar as the Japanese were concerned. He admired their military spirit, their victory over Slavic Russia in 1905, and their alleged racial purity. In Mein Kampf, he acknowledged that although the Japanese as a race had never created a culture like the Aryans, nor destroyed other cultures like the Jews, they had nevertheless adopted and made use of cultures created by others. He repeated that view even after coming to power in January 1933. So before we delve a bit deeper into why modern white supremacists fetishize Asian women, or seemingly love Japanese and other Asian cultures and believe, as JonTron said in that infamous debate with Destiny, where he was promoting the white genocide conspiracy theory as well, it's a model society for white supremacists. The reason a lot of fascists naturally like Chinese and they like Japanese historically, especially people like Hitler, is that China and Japan, despite going to war against each other, what they both had in common is that they were very efficient at killing communists. Chiang Kaishek, who was a fascist authoritarian dictator himself, killed millions upon millions of Chinese communists and later Taiwanese communists and Taiwanese native people in his brutal government. And like I said, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist China, despite eventually being closely tied with the United States, was tied with Germany for a long, long time. Chiang Kai-shek even asked Hitler for help during the rape of Nanking to show you that these groups did have quite big ties. And to a lot of white supremacists, the Japanese fascists and the Chinese fascists were admirable because of their brutality, and their nationalism was also often based in race. So Han Chinese for people like Chiang Kai-shek, for the Japanese it was this notion about this Japanese race of people, and even for a lot of white supremacists today, they think Japan is completely homogenous, and that's why it's such a great country to live, because it's extremely xenophobic and racist and doesn't let in a lot of refugees or immigrants, or even if these immigrants do get let in, like some Chinese and Koreans and other Asian groups, they are treated very, very poorly. But for a lot of white supremacists, that is a good thing. So already naturally, in the last 100 years of history, the brutality of Chiang Kai-shek and Japan in their pursuit of these ethno-nationalist states and their treatment of communists is something that is very, very admirable for these groups. And of course, like it said, Hitler also liked the Japanese for beating the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. But now let's get on a bit more to why the modern alt-right and white supremacists love or at least tolerate East Asians. So an article by Jeff Chang on the Washington Post. Of course Dylann Roof thinks Asians are racist. The media has been perpetuating that myth for years. In his reprehensible racist manifesto, Dylann Roof laid out the finer points of what he called his racial awareness. He denigrated black people as stupid and violent, the group that is the biggest problem for Americans. Other ethnic groups inspired ire, but also pity. Hispanics, he wrote, were still our enemies, but they and Jewish people might prove redeemable if they would identify more of white supremacy. And talking about the quote I read you earlier from Dylann Roof. I have great respect for the East Asian races. Even if we were to go extinct, they could carry something on. They are by nature very racist and great allies of the white race. I am not opposed at all to allies with the Northeast Asian races. The article going on to say, we might call this racist love because his grotesque admiration for Asians was not separate from a belief in the superiority of whites and a desire to denigrate and take black lives. Roof's racist love apparently included an obsession with a Japanese movie and a strange hope that Asians would join his cause. This Japanese movie was called Himizu. I don't know if any of you guys have seen that. Roof's attitude isn't new. White supremacists have vacillated between fear and fetishization of Asians for over a century. Beginning in the mid-19th century, immigrant Chinese and Japanese laborers suffered violence at the hands of whites who feared they were losing their jobs and livelihoods. By the 1920s, as Congress moved to ban all Asian immigrants, Lothrop Stoddard's book, The Rising Tide of Color, The Threat Against White Supremacy, began to rise on the bestsellers list. Fear was giving way to fascination in some circles. In his book, Stoddard warned that white civilization might be swamped by the triumphant coloured races, who will obliterate the white man by elimination or absorption. He concluded that, of all the non-white peoples, the Japanese and Chinese posed the biggest threat to global white rule. He strongly supported closing off Asian immigration to the US, but he also argued, because of what he called their industriousness and strategic guile, Asians deserve whites' mutual comprehension and respect. Such ideas have found their mainstream form in the notion of Asian Americans as a model minority. Since the late 1960s, pundits have regularly trotted out the supposed economic and social success of Asian Americans to neutralize black and Latino and even other Asian Americans, claims of racial discrimination. Although a close look at the data shows that Asian Americans in fact lag well behind whites in wealth and household per capita income, the stereotype has stuck. Asian Americans don't argue, they succeed. As Bill O'Reilly has put it, Asian people are not liberal, by nature. They're usually more industrious and hardworking. So before the 1992 LA riots, which were triggered by the acquittal of 4 policemen in the brutal beating of Rodney King, the media played a central role in inflaming tensions between Asians and African Americans. They continually replayed horrific videos of the murder of Latasha Harlins, a young black teenager shot in the back by Son Ja-do, a Korean American shopkeeper who accused the girl of stealing a bottle of orange juice. During the riots, scenes of armed Asian Americans protecting Koreatown shops were widely televised. You see a lot of white supremacists post these images. You've probably seen them. This powerful image, a conflation of the myth of the good minority with the archetype of the frontier gunfighter hero, lingers. The media still portrays the besieged immigrant shopkeeper as the central tragedy of the race riots from Ferguson through Baltimore, not the victims of police violence whose beatings and deaths started them, but the former would not have happened without the latter. So no one is going to deny that Asians have faced a lot of discrimination in the United States and continue to right now. The pandemic has seen a massive increase in attacks on Asian people, partly because a lot of right-wing people blame the pandemic solely on the Chinese government, and as we've seen a lot in Republican discourse, every Chinese person is in fact like an agent of the Chinese government, and of course for most racists, they can't tell the difference between a Chinese person and another East Asian, so they just attack random people who they think are Chinese. But of course, there's always been that racially motivated factor. But something that was interesting in that article is pointing out, despite people talking about the potential death of the white race, they still see something redeeming about Asians, where they never see something redeeming about African Americans. And the model minority myth also plays into a lot of racism, that it's black culture that keeps African Americans poor, not systemic racism, continued African American slavery through the prison system and the war on drugs, and just historic injustices that have never been solved. While Asian Americans face a lot of institutional racism, I think it's fair to say it is not on the same level black people in the United States, and the 1992 riots probably show that to a lot of people, that you have these Korean shopkeepers celebrated for shooting at black rioters, and that's the media discourse, not black victims of police brutality. So now you've got a picture of why like Nazi types love East Asians in general. And now I want to focus on Japan a bit more and maybe talk about the anime side of those things. The recent mass shooter spent a lot of time on places like 4chan. Dylann Roof was obsessed with a Japanese movie, and I think it's fair to say a lot of white supremacists glorify Japan past and present. In the past for its militaristic fascist conquests of Asia and like their fighting style, and a lot of how the samurai code was incorporated into the fascist Japanese military, but also for current Japan, because Japan has these cultural exports they like, video games and anime, but Japan also has a history of being extremely xenophobic, and that continues to today with its very harsh immigration policies, which have been relaxed somewhat in the last couple of years. But it is very hard to immigrate to Japan, and that's not to mention that the ruling party of Japan has a lot of ties to the Japanese far right, the Nippon Kaigi, and also do not apologize for the Second Sino-Japanese War, do not apologize for World War II. They still visit shrines honoring war criminals. They still do not teach their history properly, and this has been part of the Liberal Party's agenda to remove things like the rape of Nanking from history. And for a lot of white supremacists, it's something they want to base American society on. Now, just before we get any further, you guys will remember I actually made a video about this issue in terms of why racists love Japan versus the Japanese left-wing movements like the mainstream Japanese Communist Party. Here is just JonTron on his debate where he debated Destiny about like white people protecting their demographics, essentially buying into the white genocide conspiracy, and then saying Japan is a model society.
I think, sorry, one more time on that.
Do you think that it's okay for a country to stifle its growth a little bit in order to maintain a homogenous cultural identity?
Yeah, I think it's fine. Japan does it. They just did and that's what's happening right now in the West. And nobody would ask Japan if it was okay that, Japan become a minority Japanese nation.
But we're not Japan, and I don't care about Japan. You want to try to draw a parallel to another homogenous society. Japan is like the worst go-to argument. It's also a dying country of people who, because they refuse to let anybody else in, are having horrible problems with their population. I don't think Japan is the country that you want to point to as your model homogenous society.
I just disagree. I think it is a model society.
So JonTron clearly spent like way too much time on 4chan reading about this shit. But again, it's a very common sentiment for white supremacists that if they have to have an ethnostate in the current year, it would look a lot like Japan. And I guess the homogenous stuff in Japan is a bit overblown as well, because they don't accept that there are actually a lot of native groups in the territories of Japan that aren't like what you would consider stereotypical like Japanese. The dominant ethnicity of Japan, which I guess came from places like Korea and China about 2,000 plus years ago. But as you can kind of see, the alt-right belief in a lot of things to do with Asian peoples and Japan is often an extension of wider Western racist beliefs about Japan, not necessarily coming from neo-Nazis, but coming from liberals or coming from Republicans. Like it said, Bill O'Reilly was talking about Asians in this way. And this also extends to yellow fever, or the fetishization of Asian women, because a lot of neo-Nazi types also have Asian wives and Asian girlfriends. And, that might seem curious if you don't know much about them, or you haven't watched a video like mine. Why do white supremacists have girlfriends and wives who are Asian? And it's part of a wider, like I said, fetishization of Asian women. And this goes back to hundreds and hundreds of years ago. The whole idea of the Orient that Europeans and Americans believed during the colonial period, and there's certain beliefs about women, because what experience did people often have of Asian women during this period? It was opium dens, brothels. This is where Asian women would be visible in their lives, so they'd spread stereotypes about them based on this. And then you of course have the aftermath of World War II, where you have US troops stationed in devastated countries like Korea, like Japan, where of course in a very poor, devastated country, there are a lot of brothels that US servicemen would frequent, often fathering children with Asian women as well. And of the Vietnam War, where you have millions of American conscripts actually living in South Vietnam, having an experience of Vietnamese women. And of course, a lot of these soldiers, these women just existed as sexual objects. So you have all of that, and then you take it back to America. It's clear to see why a lot of just general Americans have this view of Asian women. But I guess in the more contemporary period, where do a lot of younger people get this kind of like yellow fever, as we're going to talk about? It's from things like anime. Now, I have no problem with anime as like this style of art, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of Japanese art sexualizes women in a different way to Western art. Like, there is a sexist sexualization of women in Western art, but the way it's done in Japan is often a bit different. You have like the stereotypical things of like schoolgirls with like massive breasts, and they are like very, very sexualized. Even stuff I like Japanese work from Hideo Kojima, some of the sexualization of women in that I find quite gross, but it's also really, really explicit and in your face, like Quiet from Metal Gear Solid, The Phantom Pain. So a lot of the people who become weeaboos and become obsessed with these anime girls and stuff start to actually talk about Asian women in a lot of the same ways that I guess people did back in the day in the 60s through their own experience of them in places like Vietnam. So I just want to go through a couple articles quick to show you where these myths about Asian women come from, and often how they're viewed as like subservient and obedient and like perfect partners for racist white men, and how they're often like a counterpoint to Western women who are all like feminists and they want to stand up for themselves and they don't want to obey the patriarchy. Weeaboo's not welcome, the evolution of Asian fetishization through pop culture. You kind of look like a lolly, he says. For the lucky ones who don't know what that is, a lolly is an anime term used to describe small Asian girl who is definitely a minor but is portrayed in a deeply inappropriate way. It was during a field trip last fall. All I could think to myself was, why did he say that? Was I supposed to take that as a compliment? Unfortunately, this wasn't the last time I was to encounter this type of comment. Many are familiar with yellow fever, the racial fetishization of Asians, particularly East Asians, originating from the tales of Japanese and Vietnamese prostitutes seducing US soldiers during World War II in Vietnam. It is a fantasy that Asian women are quiet, submissive, yet sexually promiscuous. In short, a misogynist's wet dream, literally. It has since manifested itself into stereotypes, books and movies, and plays such as Miss Saigon and Madame Butterfly, both which are sexist romances about the relationships between Asian prostitutes and American men. The idea that Asian women would gracefully embrace male dominance whilst being an exotic sex toy spread like an epidemic, hence the name yellow fever. Some believe that those days are over. Yellow fever, as popular culture and the internet can attest, is still very much alive. When you search up the word Asian on Instagram, Reddit or Tumblr, or any popular image sharing site, the first thing you get is porn. This fact alone is telling about how Asians, especially women, are viewed as sexual objects. Fetishization hasn't gone away, it's just evolved. But who exactly are these new generation of fetishizers? A large number of them are weeaboos, people, mostly men, obsessed with Japanese culture, particularly anime, to the point of bastardization and fetishization. Although the butt of many internet jokes, they run free in their toxic environments, able to normalize casual racism and objectification of East Asian girls via anime. Problem isn't just that these are a group of internet losers who stare all day at lewd drawings of anime girls, but how this translates into reality. It's more than subreddits that are dedicated to racy pictures of Asian girls, or threads that go on and on about how much contributors want a submissive Japanese waifu. It's more of a post describing in disgusting details their plans to woo the closest East Asian girl, or the katana collections and sexy half-nude figurines. It has a real impact. Robin Zheng, the author of the article Why Yellow Fever Isn't Flattering for the American Philosophical Association, illustrates the damages of this behavior. Yellow fever places disproportionate psychological burdens on Asian women. Women confronted with yellow fever often feel homogenized, that is, treated as interchangeable with other Asian women. They also feel otherized, that is, separated from and held to a different standard compared to white women. Since women often internalize their own objectification, learning to see themselves as the objects of others' desires, they may be vulnerable to low self-esteem, body shame, eating disorders, and other physical and psychological harms. The emergence of online communities such as weeaboos have played a role in increasing the prevalence of racial fetish, and hence the harm it causes. Just as consumers develop particular brand loyalties with which they self-identify, watching certain categories of racialized pornography may license people to self-identify with certain sexual preferences, which can strengthen the preference and make it more exclusive, so participating in such a community can contribute indirectly to harm, irrespective of how a particular individual behaves in their own life. So like I said, it isn't exclusive to Nazis, but you can see how this myth that permeates a lot of Western countries does make Asians appealing to Nazis, because they believe in these racial stereotypes and racial myths of Asians in general and Asian women, which make them feel like they are compatible to Nazi ideology and therefore acceptable in some ways. And anime is just one of many things that can spread this racist image of Asian women, and of course actually has very damaging effect on Asian women. In the video I made before, which is now gone, there was a profile on Instagram which just collected loads of Tinder messages that were racist to Asian women, often just like, you know, typical yellow fever stuff, like talking about anime, talking about them being geishas and stuff like that. Honestly, really, really gross, and maybe something that doesn't get talked about enough. But like I said, you can imagine why the alt-right do have a place for Asian women in their new ethnostate. So I just want to read one more article about the contemporary alt-right and Asian women. So on the Lily opinion by Tamara K. Nopper, the alt-right likes Asian American women, we shouldn't be surprised. Although being stereotyped as hypersexual and submissive, Asian women are also presumed to be aggressive when it comes to propagating family success, which may ultimately be attractive for a combination of stereotypes to some white supremacists. These days, many people want a meme rather than the real, and for some white supremacist men who are ultimately concerned with their survival and power, the tiger mum may be just the thing. The tiger mum is a variation of the model minority, mythologizes the role of parenting, family structure, and family values and ethnic pride as the primary determinants of minority succeeding in a competitive society. As a model minority type, the tiger mum is demanding, has extremely high expectations of her children, and relevant to white supremacist anxiety of self-protection, ethnocentric. Scholar Susan Koshi encourages us to consider why Asian women may be considered viable alternatives to empowered white women by anti-feminist white men in ways black women are not. While it seems obvious, after all, white supremacist primary target is black people, Koshi emphasizes how racist discourses of black femininity depicts black women as bad wives and mothers. These specific stereotypes of black women help us better understand the fetishization of Asian women, in Koshi's words, simultaneously hypersexualized, marriageably feminine. So interesting points there, particularly about the tiger mum trope, which is something I hadn't seen discussed a lot before making this video, because of course I knew tons about the sexual fetishization of Asian women and how they're seen as like this quiet, submissive partner potentially, but also the view they could be useful in pushing your family forward and like educating your children and disciplining them properly based on these racial stereotypes is again something that is very interesting, especially because most Nazis believe that the women's role is exclusively to be like the head of raising the family's children, and that is pretty much it. There isn't much place for women in any other facet of society according to white supremacists and Nazis. So throughout the video, I hope I've illustrated to you, while seemingly white supremacy doesn't really accept any other race but the made up white race, there are a lot of exceptions, and this goes back fundamentally to the OG fascists in the 1930s, particularly Hitler, being accepting of East Asians, particularly the Chinese and the Japanese, and how the Japanese and Chinese actions in things like the Sino-Japanese War or the Chinese Civil War is something that is respected among white supremacists. And of course, these white supremacist types love Japan because they believe, because it's ethnically homogenous as they see it, there are no problems there. It's a relative utopia. So to these white supremacists, these East Asians are compatible with this white supremacist society. So it's not surprising for this sort of rhetoric to pop up in the recent mass shooters manifesto, and the widespread racism against Asian women in society, which the alt-right and Nazis kind of like extend even further, is just proof that there hasn't been enough done to combat these racial stereotypes that date back to colonialism, World War II, Vietnam, and continue today with things like 4chan anime communities. But anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Like, subscribe, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.